I think you have to negotiate with your husband, first of all. You have to negotiate when you're going to have a date.
Why did you assume this was about sexual submission?
I didn't. I thought we were going to dance.
Mom wins that round.
Yeah, you do. Good one for you. Good one, Tammy. Everybody is going to have something wrong with them in relationship to the pursuit of what's best. Like, I'm not smart enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not charismatic enough.
I don't have enough money.
I don't have enough influence. Like, there's going to be impediments. And God's response is, I don't care what your impediments
That's
are. You
your
can
challenge.
overcome them.
That's your
That's
challenge.
right.
How do you overcome bitterness and contempt in a relationship? You'd have to figure out every single problem, right? You'd have to go down to the bottom with every single problem.
If we have an interpersonal issue, let's say it's come up a couple of times so that I can be sure it's there. Neither of us are going to want to broach it particularly. And the reason for that is that as you delve into something like that, you go into the inferno. Often when the hero sees the monster, the first time he'll turn tail and run. And usually what'll happen is people will cry, insult each other, or they'll further the fight, or they'll run out of words, and they just stop before they actually solve the problem. And then you might ask, well, why are people afraid to delve into it? I was out with my friend, John Peppard, who was an ornery guy who ended
My
up in
first
the rigs.
boyfriend.
John was very funny, very tough kid, like very,
Grade
very
5,
witty,
4 or something.
charismatic kid. And we were on some gravel, and I had my hand down on the gravel for some reason, and he stopped the 10-speed on my hand. And he did it by accident, but it tore it up pretty badly, so all 3 of my fingers were like torn to rat shit. And when we started to fight, Andrew Cox, the first thing he did was grab my hand, twist the hell out of it, and anyways, that ended it badly. And I got harassed about being beat up by this little rat of a kid for like a year. So, which was definitely
That's
not
dirty.
the least bit of fun.
No.
Yeah.
So now you know.
Yeah, well, you know, what goes around comes around.
Okay, well, welcome back to my podcast. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you
Good to see you too.
Good to see you, Mikhaila.
in your house and everything.
Yeah, wow, a house.
Nice podcast studio.
Thanks. I spent a lot of time choosing wallpaper. Like a lot of my life is gone from choosing wallpaper. I've seen a lot of wallpaper.
Well, I
Well,
think
it's
it was
good.
worth it.
It's good to have your priorities right.
Thanks. Jordan actually chose this one.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Even though Jordan chose
So I took a bunch of questions from my audience, said you guys were coming on. And so I think we're just going to roll through as many questions as we can get through, which should be like 3. We'll see. We'll see. Carrie, you ready? We're going to start with an easy one. Bob Dylan or Tom Waits?
Well, Jordan would say Tom Waits.
You better say Tom Waits.
I'd say Tom
That's
Waits.
a hard one, but we do listen to a lot of Tom Waits and not so much Bob Dylan. So that's
So you're staying
my
middle of
answer.
the road, but Tom Waits. I'm going with Tom Waits. Bob Dylan
Tom
kinda-
Waits has way more good songs. Like almost every Tom Waits song is good. And there's a lot of them. And he's profound. And yeah, he's great. And Tammy pointed him out to me just to make
Really?
that clear. Yes.
Yeah, when I was a young woman, I used to go to record stores and choose records by their covers. And I chose a Tom Waits album and took it home and put it on and thought, wow,
You would
what's
choose
this?
You would choose albums by their cover.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
funny.
there was a lot of that in the 70s.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, how else were you going to
Oh,
know?
nice
Oh,
big
how were you
covers.
going to know?
We bought a lot
True.
of random albums. Everybody's album collection had like a large proportion of duds in it. Plus, the other things that record companies used to do too, which was hyper annoying, was they'd put one good song on a collection of like 30 clunkers. So we
Yeah.
had to make mixtapes too, which took a lot of work, right? Because we were recording on cassette tapes. So making a mixtape was a many-hour job. And part of your reputation as a teenager was definitely dependent on the quality of your mixtape.
We made mixed CDs. People don't do that at all anymore. Everything's just Spotify.
It was
Yeah,
fun.
playlist.
Oh, but they make playlists.
Yeah.
That's easy though.
Oh, yeah,
Even
it's-
burning a CD was kind of a pain, and you had to download off like LimeWire or something.
Yeah, well, we had to do it with records, so you had to borrow your friends' records.
Yeah,
to make
that's
the
worse.
Playlists. So, like a good mixtape, that was a valuable item.
You give that to who you have a crush on.
And you had to pick your cassette properly too. And part of your reputation as a teenage boy was whether or not you knew the difference between the different grades of cassette tapes.
They made
'Cause
good
chromium-
Christmas presents.
They did. They
Yeah.
did mixtapes. Well, we gave CDs out as Christmas presents for a while.
Yeah.
Mixtapes, Western blues.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, because we collected a lot of old Western music in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Because in Boston, when you were a kid, you could go down to the vinyl shops and, buy records for 50 cents. They weren't worth anything. And so I collected a lot of old Western music. And sometimes that was from the covers too, because the cheesier the cover, the better the song was basically the rule for Western vinyl.
Hey guys, if you didn't know, my dad's going on tour for his upcoming We Who Wrestle with God book. If you guys like the biblical series on YouTube, you're going to love this. Tickets are available at jordanbpeterson.com, and honestly, if there are any of the lectures you guys should go to, it's one on this tour. It could change your life. Listening to Dad's lectures brought Mom closer to God, and I think that's what he's hoping to do for people. I'm not sure what other lecture you can go to that's trying to deliver that. Mom's going to be opening for him, and hopefully I can come along to some of the shows, but we'll see how baby George and my sleep feels about that. Tickets are available at jordanbpeterson.com for shows in the U.S. starting in February. There are also meet and greet tickets still available. I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, going in a completely different direction. How to adapt to submitting to your partner when you're a stubborn, strong-minded woman.
I guess that's for me.
Says the stubborn, strong-minded woman. Okay, what do you think?
Well, I think you have to negotiate with your husband, first of all. You have to negotiate when you're going to have a date, and then you have to honor that. And the way you honor that is when the day comes that's the day of the date, you have to make sure you're rested, and it's up to you. It's not up to anybody else to take that time. It's up to you. And
Why did you assume this was about sexual submission?
I didn't. I thought we were going to dance.
Mom wins that round.
Yeah, you do. Good one for you. Good one, Tammy. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the idea of submission. Like part of this strong woman thing here that this questioner is tangled up in is there's no submission in a relationship if you have any sense. Nobody submits. That's ridiculous.
Well, in the Bible, I think she's referring to in the Bible when it says submit to your
Yeah, but
husband.
submit in the biblical context is a very complicated notion.
And it's not just women to men, it's men to women too.
Well, it's also predicated on the idea in the biblical corpus that if you're married properly, your husband has already submitted himself to, well, in the Jewish tradition, to the Mosaic commandments, to the prophets and the law, and in the Christian tradition, that he submitted himself to the ultimate authority of Christ. And so it isn't that you're submitting to your husband, it's that you are placing yourself in a hierarchy that's aimed at the highest possible aim.
So between the two of you, you're submitting to the marriage.
Yeah.
And what's best for the marriage.
Yeah, and the marriage is a sacrament, and that means that it's a marriage under the auspices of Christ and God. And what that means is that you're both aiming up, you're both acting in each other's best interests and your own best interest, but in the highest sense, and that your communication is based on logos, which is the divine word, which is truth. And so if all that is happening, there's no submission except in a really narrow sense. So
you're submitting to what's best.
yeah, you're sacrificing what's lowest to what's highest. And that's a submission of sorts. But really what it is it's a disciplining of your whims. Because when you say you want something, that isn't really accurate. Generally what you mean, if it's a selfish desire, is that some whim in you, some short-term whim that's only operating for immediate hedonic gratification, has got you in its grip. And you think, well, this is what I want. It's like, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. But a more accurate way of looking at it is that something in you wants it and you've submitted to that. And so you're not supposed to do that. And so partly what you do in a marriage, if you have any sense, is that you help each other organize your wants and needs in a proper hierarchy that's oriented up. And then you might ask, well, what does it mean up? Because that would be the moral relativism standpoint. Well, up is a matter of dispute or a matter of contention, which is also complete bloody rubbish, because up is partly an emergent property of what will sustain your relationship over time. So if you're interacting with the same person multiple times and you submit them to your whims or you use power, that whole relationship is going to go south in no time flat. They're going to get bitter and resentful and work against you. And even if they do submit, they're going to do it begrudgingly. And so that's certainly going to do your love life in about 5 seconds flat. And so you're submitting to a pattern of attention and action that enables you to engage in optimized reciprocal interactions across a very long span of time. There's nothing arbitrary about that. It's the same thing that kids do when they make a friendship. So what kids will do when they come together is one kid will offer the other a game. And the first rule is you offer the game. And the second rule is the other person has to want to play.
That's the negotiation.
Yeah, that's the beginning of the negotiation, to agree on the game and to agree on the aim. Well, then you have to see if it's fun to play with that person, which means all the micro games within the game are also voluntary and aimed in the proper direction, which would be at least keeping the fun going. And then at a higher level, keeping the relationship going. And so then when a child chains games together with a person, that's the beginning of a friendship. So a friendship is a game of games, right? And then there's an ethos that's associated with the friendship that would have to do with trust and respect, that without which those repeated interactions are no longer desirable. And so that's all what constitutes up. And if you have any sense, you submit to that, because why wouldn't you? Especially once you understand it.
And I think there's a lot of talk in the red pilled sphere that's very popular online. That's, if you're a man and you're in a relationship with a woman, they should listen to you because you're the man. And it's basically as simple as that.
I see.
And what you're saying is in the Bible, it's submit to a higher good.
Yeah, well, the man is supposed to reflect Christ, but so is the marriage. And
I don't know if the red-pilled guys are doing that.
Well, they're not doing that if any of the submission is based on power, because one of the things that's made staggeringly crystal clear in the biblical corpus, Moses is punished dreadfully for using power, even though he's a great leader, right? He is condemned to death before he enters the promised land because he uses power when God tells him to use his voice.
Yeah.
Right. And then the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers, who are Christ's paramount enemies, and that also goes for the Romans as well, they're, at least in part, people who use power, force, and compulsion instead of negotiation, voluntary negotiation towards a higher good. So the notion that the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, is patriarchal in that it justifies the use of masculine force, that's utterly preposterous. There's nothing about that that's even vaguely true. And you see that in part too because, well, first of all, right when the biblical corpus opens, one of the first pronouncements is that both men and women are made in the image of God. Right? There's an absolute insistence in that. And then, the feminist critics will say, well, yeah, but Eve is cast in a bad light. It's like, yeah, so is Adam. Because Eve takes the first bite, but Adam submits to her temptation in a second, and then he blames her for his faults, which men do to women all the time. And vice versa. I mean, we're pretty good at that both ways. And then in the Christian tradition, Christ treats women as of equal value in a radical manner throughout the entire corpus of his ministry, which is really when we have any documentation of his actions. And he takes a lot of flack for that. So no, there's no submitting.
Cool.
Plus, it's impossible anyways. You try to get a woman to submit, good luck. It's just not possible.
Not for very long.
They're slippery.
Who got Jordan Uggs? I posted a picture of us for Christmas. I was like, this is such a nice family photo. And you were wearing your green silk pajamas.
Oh, no.
And that's all anybody talked about.
Yeah,
it's like it didn't even occur to me when I was posting it.
It's my Hugh Hefner fantasy.
Yeah, that got mentioned a lot.
I'm sure it
And then
did,
the
yeah.
Uggs.
I thought that, I thought that was funny. I was looking through robes and I thought,
Oh, this was on purpose.
Green satin, that's just perfect. Yeah, well, you got to have a sense of humor, you know.
He wears them all the time. It's not just funny.
Yeah, but you like them.
Yeah, they're all right.
Yeah, see? Yeah, I knew
They're
she'd like
soft.
them, right?
You know,
Yeah,
they're nice. They're shiny.
shiny, just like, yeah, I know, it's easy to attract a crow.
Yeah.
Okay, a bunch of people asked about this in different forms, but it's about how to have emotional control. So a lot of people having trouble controlling emotions. So suggestions on how to keep emotions under control.
Pause. You know, you don't keep them under control necessarily. What you do is you notice that you have something that is in discord, so you have an emotion about it, right? So you're responding, you're reacting to something emotionally. You pause and you don't say anything, because now you're in a place of the unknown,
Chaos.
right? You're in the place of the unknown, and so you have to wait until you can see what the next right thing is to do, and you can be really out of control, upset, and the best thing you can do for yourself right then is to breathe and wait and just try to keep it steady and figure out, listen.
So it's negative emotion that people are talking about rather than emotion per se, because nobody's that worried about a sudden outburst of good humor.
Or joy.
So, right. So, you know, although that can get you in trouble. But Carl Jung said emotion emerges where adaptation is weakest, and that's associated with the idea of chaos. And so if we're talking and you say something that disrupts the flow of conversation and causes an outbreak of emotion, that reveals some impediment or obstacle to our further communication, maybe with regard to the topic that we're discussing or with regard to our broader relationship. And the emotion is actually, it's an indicator of some element of the territory we both inhabit that hasn't been mapped properly. And so the emotion comes up as a warning, and it says, unknown thing happening, unknown and threatening thing happening. And then it's not necessarily much more specific than that. And then it can take a lot of work to figure out exactly what the problem is, right? But that's what you want to do, is you want to, and you don't want to jump to the conclusion, for example, that you're right and the other person is wrong, which would be highly convenient and easy for you. And you can understand why people would want to do that, because it's the least amount of effort. But the reason you shouldn't do that is because it's possible that you're the idiot. And then you might even ask, well, even if I am the idiot, if I can convince the other person that they're stupid and wrong, why shouldn't I do that? And the answer is, well, you might be an idiot with other people too, and with yourself. And so if you don't fix the problem, then you're going to fall into the same hole repeatedly. And what the negative emotion is actually an alarm system telling you that there's a hole, and that is a hole where chaos reigns, where things are happening that you don't understand or expect. So it's a prerequisite to further exploration. It's very common in hero mythology. One of the things you see is that the hero will be on a quest. And a quest is always for the thing that's valuable. And so we're always on a quest, because always, with every glance of our eye, we're on a quest. And it's very common in hero mythology, which I suppose represents the larger and more dramatic quests, that when the hero first encounters the dragon, let's say the monster, the giant, dragon is usually like an image of nature gone astray, and a giant is usually an image of culture gone astray. And so those are the two major quests, right? To confront and reconstitute pathological structures of adaptation, that's sort of the anti-patriarchy ethos, and then to confront nature and horror in its base form. So a gigantic dragon would have aspects of both of those. In any case, often when the hero sees the monster the first time, he'll turn tail and run. You see this in the Pinocchio story, for example, too. Pinocchio goes down into the depths to find God, essentially, the God that has died in the depths, in the most chaotic and dangerous possible place. And he's pretty resolute in his determination to do that in an attempt to transform. But when he actually confronts the whale in the depths, initially, it's like, hey, oh man, I'm out of here, you know. And that's very common. And you see that you see that very commonly when an emotion arises. It's the emotional rise. It's negative. It's anxious. And people's first reflex is to say, this isn't happening, to pretend that it's not necessary to delve into it. And then you might ask, well, why are people afraid to delve into it? And this is where you can learn to understand something like Dante's Inferno. So if we have an interpersonal issue, let's say it's come up a couple of times so that I can be sure it's there. It's not just some random fluctuation in your mood or that you were hungry or that I was hungry, something trivial. It's happened a couple of times, so I know there's something there. Okay, well, neither of us are going to want to broach it particularly. And the reason for that is that as you delve into something like that, you go into the inferno. So Dante illustrated hell, 9 layers, with some terrible thing which was satanic at the bottom, right? Sort of evil itself. And if you take any issue that produces negative emotion, like an issue that actually exists, and you decompose it completely, you'll go all the way to the bottom, right? And part of the reason for that is that, like, anything threatening is reflective of threat and vulnerability itself, right? So it's like it's a single manifestation of something central and a relatively trivial manifestation. Maybe there's many, but if you delve into it deeply enough, you'll come up against the problem per se. One of the things you find with people, if they have an interpersonal conflict and you delve deeply into it, you often find an act of betrayal at the bottom. Someone betrayed them at some point, and they have a memory of that, right? And you could think of that as a semi-trauma, depending on its depth, but they'll have a memory of that. And Dante put the betrayers at the bottom of hell. And the reason he did that was because human interactions that iterate across time are dependent on trust. And what someone who betrays you does is entice you to trust them. So they take your best instincts, because trust is a form of courage and it's a predicate for society. And then they turn it against you. Right. And so, right. So threat emerges, you get negative emotion. If you dig into it, you spiral down, till you get to the bottom of things. And that's what people say. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Right. Yeah, well, Jesus, sometimes, man, that's a long way down. And people just can't stand it, because they'll start talking to each other and they'll go down one rung at a time. And every time they go down, because they're getting closer to the ugly truth, more and more emotion emerges. And usually what'll happen is people will cry, or they'll insult each other, or they'll further the fight, or they'll run out of words, and they just stop before they actually solve the problem. It takes a lot of fortitude to get to the bottom.
There was
So one more thing. Virgil guides Dante through the Inferno, and that's a kind of a reflection of the idea of the Holy Ghost. So the Holy Ghost, element of the Trinity, the Holy Ghost is the Spirit of truth. That's a good way of thinking about it. Scientists who observe their data sets properly are guided by the Spirit of truth. Otherwise, they just twist and bend the data to suit their career, for example. So imagine that you're oriented towards the truth. Okay, so now you have an aim. And that calibrates your emotions, and it calibrates your judgment. And so if you're trying to mediate an interpersonal dispute and you have the right goal in mind, so the right goal might be peaceful, continued, productive, generous, harmonious existence, right? Then your emotions will calibrate so you can tell when the conversation is deviating from that aim. And if you're forthright in your aim, you can use your judgment to descend down, and you can stay oriented while you're doing it.
Yeah, and plus it isn't so personal then, because you've decided that the aim is truth.
Yeah.
Then what you bring to truth is subordinate to that, and it's less focused on you as an individual, because you are a collective of people who've all made the similar errors over.
Well, and
all of
you're
time.
also not trying to demonstrate your moral superiority
No.
while trying to solve the problem, because that won't go over well. So that dissent, even if it's between two people, has to be a dissent that's predicated on mutual humility. If you're a therapist, for example, and you're guiding someone through that, there's a very high probability that you're going to encounter all sorts of terrible things about yourself, even as a therapist, while you're walking the person down that pathway. And you have to do it, especially as you go deeper and deeper, you have to do it with extreme care. And, you can imagine that, well, if you're a therapist, for example, maybe you want to show what a good therapist you are. And so you want to take over the process. That's just a sin of pride. It'll take you off the course. And then, especially when you start to get deeper into things, you'll be in real trouble. Because the deeper down you go, the higher the price you pay for any sin that will knock you off the right path. You have to step carefully.
If you don't have an air purifier, get one. It's like dieting for your lungs, except it's easier than dieting. We're breathing in so many chemicals, mold, bacteria, mold, all the time, and filtering your air is the laziest thing you can do to clean your environment. So if you're not doing it, there's really no excuse. I use Air Oasis filters all over our house. They filter down to a smaller particle size, 0.003 microns, than most air purifiers, which makes a massive difference. They're quiet too. I also bought them for Scarlett's school to help reduce virus transmission because little kids are icky. They have a medical grade H13 HEPA filter to trap dust, pollen, and smoke. Air Oasis iAdapt Air uses germicidal UV technology to constantly sterilize itself and the environment so the filter doesn't get moldy. It has a silver ion filter that penetrates the cell membrane of mold, bacteria, and viruses. It reduces pathogens by up to 99% in the air you're breathing. These things also come with free shipping, a lifetime warranty, and a 60-day money-back guarantee. Get 10% off your purchase by using code MP at checkout and by going to the link in the bio, which is airoasis.com/product/iAdaptAir-large, but that's linked in the comments. Enjoy the rest of this episode. There was another question anyway that had to do with this, which was how do you overcome bitterness and contempt in a relationship? Which is you'd have to figure out every single problem, right? You'd have to go down to the bottom with every single problem.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I think so. I would take the most recent first.
Start with the
Right.
recent one.
The most recent, and that stand out for you as problems. So outline all of those, and when you've gone through all of those, then maybe a few months later, you'll want to go again, and this time you'll go deeper and maybe further back in your history. And so you don't do it. I wouldn't. If you did it all at once, it'd be a very long time and exhaustive. It'd be too difficult. So
also there'll be classes of problems. Like you have to eliminate all of the issues, but that doesn't mean you have to address every single thing that happened because there'll be classes of things that happen. And so now,
especially as you go down, you'll notice the classes.
Going down is noticing the classes. That's exactly it. So imagine there's a lot of individual occurrences, right? But then if you go a level down, you can see, well, these 5 occurrences were part of this. So now you go down one level and you see there's this clump and this clump. And then you go down another level and you say, oh, these 2 clumps are this clump. Right, well, then you can go down. This is kind of what psychoanalysts do instead of behaviorists. The behaviorists will stay on the periphery and deal with things one by one, like very minute, practical, specific issues. The psychoanalysts will go deeper and say, these 20 things are a reflection of this underlying concept, which could be implicit or unconscious, because some of this is a delving into implicit or unconscious structures. Sometimes those are revealed in dreams or in fantasies. So you do have to address everything that's between you in a relationship. But that doesn't mean you have to go through every bloody thing that ever happened in the whole relationship. You do have to solve, the psychoanalysts would have called those clumps complexes. And sometimes when you go down into the substructure of someone's psyche, you'll find, that they have a key problem, with the world. Like I had one client, for example, who really was paranoid about authority, like really verging on true paranoia. Well, when we got to the bottom of one of her experiences, she told me a story about having been put in a hospital when she was 5 and being subjected without her parents being around, because at that time, parents weren't allowed to visit their children in hospitals because the doctors at least said that they felt that the continued separation was worse than just one separation.
That's so stupid.
Yeah, well, it was very self-serving of the physicians, but in any case, that was her situation. She had a sadistic nurse.
Oh no.
Right. So she was just tortured in the hospital by this sadistic nurse. And so that permanently destroyed her trust in institutions and fed a paranoia that infected all of her relationships.
Yeah, I get that.
So well, sure, you can see exactly how that would happen. Now, hypothetically, if you can go down there and address that fundamental distrust, then all of the specific manifestations will also disappear. But it's very complicated because, see, as you go down to the center, you're dealing with more and more archetypal issues. So one of the things you could say about the situation she was in was that she was archetypally confronting the evil uncle of the king, the evil brother of the king. So every hierarchy has a shadow. The shadow is what the left-wingers always point to. It's all about power. It's like, no, it's only all about power when it gets corrupt. It's a very important distinction. But the claim that power can corrupt and twist and bend, and that it might even be the primary dementing phenomenon, that's dead on right. Well, so she encountered a negative manifestation of authority. It's the same as the evil uncle. It's Scar in The Lion King, fundamentally. Or the evil advisor of the, like Jafar in what is it, Aladdin.
Yeah.
That character's everywhere. The evil advisor of the king who wants to be king himself. Luciferian intellect, usually, that utilizes power. Well, that's what she came up against when she was 5. That nurse used authority to, she subordinated authority to whim. She was sadistic. She enjoyed hurting other people, and she used her authority to do that. And so that 5-year-old kid came face to face with something that's like darkly evil. And that was the trauma. And most people who are traumatized by malevolence, right? By like the voluntary desire to hurt. She certainly encountered that. She didn't know what to do about that when she was 5. So it really put a warp in her whole life.
I feel like you said, a lot of people encounter this and that's what traumatizes them. At what point is what you experience reality though? So say, I mean, there are people in positions of authority that abuse authority. We've obviously seen that in the last number of years with the government overreaching and things. So at what point do you just view, I think I have an issue with this. Mm-hmm. Like if I see people in positions of authority, particularly in the medical industry, the mainstream medical industry, I think you've been taught to think you know everything and that makes you more dangerous than the average person, right? Well, what point is that just true? More often than not.
Well, that's a constant, what would you say, challenge to judgment, right? I mean, the general rule, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is part of the problem with populist conservatives. You know, when a populist conservative gets up and says, all the institutions are rotten, like he's that far away from like a postmodernist radical. And so you're always separating the wheat from the chaff in your evaluation of authority structures. And partly what you do is differentiate them. You know, you might say, well, the whole medical profession is corrupt, but you don't actually believe that. You meet doctors from time to, well, so you have to differentiate your view. And that's complex.
You have to become informed. You have to become more and more informed if you have that view, because the view is vague. Right? So when I was 17, I was working in a pool. I needed to, there was a rule that was being not followed. These little kids were too short to be in the pool. So the pool was too deep and I didn't want to let them in without extra people in the pool. And I asked the schools to give me extra people. And the next week they came and they didn't bring them and I closed the pool. And the town council called a meeting and they called me in. And they asked me why I turned the school away, and I told them why.
Weren't you picking up kids out of the pool?
Yeah, well, there were kids that were, you know, when anybody can't swim and they get under the water, they just look at you because they don't know what to do to get back up, so they don't move their limbs. They just look at you. So here we're on the deck going, that one's underwater, that one's underwater. And I thought, like, this is not a good idea. And I'd worked in that pool, but I hadn't worked with these little kids at school time, so I hadn't realized just how deep it was and how dangerous it was. And it was an old pool built in 1967 when the last expo was on. They built swimming pools all through Canada.
Oh.
Yeah, in all the little towns. Anyway, I went to the town council meeting, and I said that I couldn't run the pool the way that they wanted me to run the pool. I needed this safety measure put in place. And they said, well, they didn't they didn't think that that was a reasonable request, and asked me to just run the pool the way they wanted to. And I said, fine, you can sign a paper telling me the way you want me to run it, and I'll go back and I'll run it that way, just to try to bring it home to them that now, okay, so you're
Well, and one of the
you're in
counselors
charge.
said to you, he was annoyed that he was being put on the spot, and he
Yeah.
said, "You'd let one of those kids drown just to get us." Right. So
And I was 17, and I
Wow.
quit my job because I felt, I was
Betrayed.
I felt betrayed, right? And that betrayal caused cynicism for government
Yeah,
establishments. So I didn't vote. For quite a while, I didn't want anything to do with any government authority of any kind, and that went on.
Well, she was
for
always
years
annoyed
and
if,
years.
if I evinced any sort of political ambition.
Yeah, I was
And
like,
she
"Eh."
would say things like, "It's all like the small town."
No,
And-
I would say I'm going to become a cartoonist and do caricatures.
Oh, I
every
Yeah,
year."
well, that's
Remember that.
That's fine. Well, that was
Yeah, but
amusing,
but in the same vein,
but it
though,
was also to your point. She was also right.
Yeah.
Like the corruption she saw at that small town level, that cynicism, that unwillingness to
Think.
adopt proper responsibility, the willingness to throw her under the bus, because this actually became a bit of a scandal. Did your dad write the newspaper?
No, I wrote him, and the mayor wrote.
Right, and it was published in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, but Tammy's observation that the corruption that she saw in the local council was the same as the corruption at every level was accurate. But the response isn't, the
Everyone's
entire
corrupt.
political system is corrupt and needs to be violently overthrown by idiot rebels, or that we should descend into a state of anarchy, or that you don't have to take responsibility on the political front. It's like the evil, you said, where's the reality? The reality is the evil uncle is always there. Always. But then there's a higher reality than that even, which is the evil uncle that you should really be concerned about is in your heart, right? The place to address that, and this is one of the fundamental messages at the highest level of the Judeo-Christian ethic. I mean, it definitely points out that worldly power is subject to corruption. But then the answer to dealing with the corruption isn't to worry about the corruption, the mote in someone else's eye, right? It's like, you're probably not perfect. And so if you're concerned about the political system, you should get your act together. And then maybe you could take requisite political action in a way that wouldn't be contaminated by power and hedonism, right? And the subordination of everyone else to your whim. But that's an internal battle. There's a notion of jihad in Islam that's like that. There's a jihad that can be conducted in the world that's more warlike against the unbeliever, right? That can easily translate into kind of like a psychopathic warlikeness. But there's a spiritual jihad that's an inner battle that's akin, at least in principle, to the Judeo-Christian insistence that the fundamental moral struggle is in the soul, right? Not in the political landscape. Or even deeper, that the political struggles are actually reflections of battles that should be conducted in the soul, but aren't being, and are then therefore externalized. So in your marriage, you'll hit bumps with your husband, say, that repeat. And you might say, well, why are there repeating bumps in my relationship with my husband? And the answer is, well, there's a knot in your soul or in his that hasn't been untied. And so because the person in whose soul that knot exists hasn't taken the time to untangle it, it makes itself manifest in the world as conflict. And that is how it works. And so it's useful, and this has to do with prayer, I suppose, with confession as well. One of the things that's very useful if you're fighting with your whoever, your daughter, your brother, your sister, your wife, you want to figure out what the hell you're bringing to it. and you don't do that in a
Yeah.
false humility. I'm parading my moral virtue because I'm so good at discovering my flaws sort of way. It's like, you got to be afraid of that in the proper way. It's like, do you want to have this fight 1,000 times? Or do you want to fix it? And if you think through what it means to have the fight 1,000 times, you get family relationships that are poisoned for decades because people won't.
Because you
Go
teach
down
your
the
children that that's
inferno.
the way to act
Yeah.
through your actions. And if your actions are filled with, say, resentment, and so that that's what you're showing, your kids are learning that, oh, this is the way my mom's relationship is with her sister. So that's a family relationship. Oh, so then they start looking,
Start imitating
it
it.
just keeps going
Yeah,
and
yeah,
going
go-
and
yeah,
going.
yeah.
And you don't want that to go down the generations. Like, stop it now.
Yeah. I'm going to pick something more positive.
Look, it is positive.
It is. Yes.
It is positive. I
That's
know
what I was
it's
thinking.
weird, but the thing is, this is the weird thing about, let's say, confession. You can regard the discovery of a devil in your soul as a treasure, because if you find something that you're really
Yeah.
doing wrong,
Yeah.
and you actually understand that it's wrong, first of all, you'll understand why you did it in the past, and that's not nothing. But more importantly, you can shed it. And so it's one of these moral inversions, like there's an insistence in the gospel texts in particular that the highest serves the lowest, that there's a strange relationship between the highest and the lowest. And one of those strange relationships is that in a sense, there shouldn't be anything more exciting than the discovery of the conscious discovery of your own insufficiency. Because then you can address it. And if you got really good at that, what that would
Yeah.
mean is you'd be getting rid of everything that is causing you trouble. And God only knows what your life could be like if you got rid of everything that you could get rid of, right? That's that's proper sacrifice. And you have to be, well, that's where humility comes in. It's like, probably a lot of me needs to go. But in the back of your mind, it should also be, well, that's probably better than all of me.
Just think of all the new.
Right,
going
right.
to
That's right.
bloom.
That's right. Exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. What happens when you're freed from that? Yeah.
That's the resurrection in the death.
I think it took me, because you both told Julian and I when we were little, tell the truth. That's the most important thing you can do, is tell the truth. But it's really hard to understand. And even having you guys as parents, it's still really hard to understand, especially if you tell the truth and you get in trouble as a kid, because then it's pretty obvious, well, this
Why'd I do
doesn't
this?
seem to be going well, before you can really think about it or see any long-term repercussions. I think it wasn't until so it was probably, I probably knew more solidly that it was important to tell the truth by the time my brain developed. I was probably 23, where it was like, no, I've seen the repercussions of lying. Telling the truth is important. But then I didn't realize that also not saying what you thought was also not
Right,
telling the
right.
truth.
Yeah.
So then it
That's
took
more
another, 4 years, maybe. So maybe 27, to be like, oh, okay, also all the thoughts I have that I'm not saying, that is also not telling the truth. And those also matter, just as much.
Or more.
Yeah, and so...
Yeah, the most common sin, classically speaking, the church has held that sins of commission are more deadly, let's say, than sins of omission.
Yeah.
So an outright falsehood is more
Yes.
deadly than avoiding the truth. But I'm very
I don't know.
torn about
Yeah, I
that,
don't
It
because
probably
either.
depends what it is.
well, it does. But the problem with a sin of omission is they're a lot easier to rationalize.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't have to say anything. It's
maybe I'd hurt people.
well, you don't run the whole simulation when you say something like that. It's, well, I don't really have to say anything. You don't think, I don't really have to say anything, but I'll be bitter and resentful and I'll play the role of martyr for the next 3 decades. You just truncate that, right? And so then you're not even viewing the severity of the avoidance. And you're right about what kids do. This is why everyone lies. So people lie to gain things that they don't deserve to gain. and they lie to avoid paying a price that they need to pay.
That's probably mostly what I did, was to
Well,
avoid. I was just avoiding things that I thought were bad.
Right,
Like whenever
right.
I
And-
lied, it was
right,
just
right.
avoiding like.
Well, and it's a short-term strategy.
Yeah.
And it works in the short term, which is part of the reason that it's so attractive.
Kind of. It makes you feel bad.
Well, that's because it violates your conscience, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, and your conscience, you could think of your conscience in part as the instinct that calibrates the medium to the long run. So let's say you have to admit that you did something wrong because you're being called on it by your parents and there's going to be trouble. And now you lie and you avoid the trouble. Well, you violate the conscience because the conscience is learned. It's an instinct as well. It's calibrating the medium to long run. And so it knows that you sacrifice the medium to long run for the present. That in your conscience, that's like a definition of what conscience does. It always says to you, you sacrifice the higher to the lower, right? So that's a false sacrifice. That's the kind of sacrifice that Cain makes constantly. And that's why that's why his life goes to hell. You're called upon, imagine there's a hierarchy of value with something at the pinnacle. And there always is, because even when you're just looking at a specific object, there's something at the pinnacle. You're always organizing your perceptions and actions around an aim. You're always climbing up a mountain of one form or another. Always, always. The rule is if you're in a hierarchy of value, that you sacrifice what's lower to what's higher. That's the nature of progress. A false sacrifice is the reverse. And conscience will tell you when you're making a false sacrifice, because it says, well, you might have skirted some trouble temporarily, but you're no longer climbing up the proper mountain. So, yeah. So I've been playing in We Who Wrestle with God, in this new book that I'm writing. I've been playing with the relationship between what's sacred and emotion, playing, I suppose, the border between biology and theology. And so one of the ways that God makes himself manifest in the Old Testament in particular is as a calling. So you can imagine that there are things that grip your interest and make you enthusiastic, right? And they have a kind of autonomy because you find that you're interested in something or you discover it and it grips you. And you can go along with that and you can follow that. When I wrote Maps of Meaning, that was what I concentrate on most. I have a chapter in there called The Divinity of Interest. And I was developing the idea that one of the golden threads that orients you in your life is things that interest you. That's the burning bush, by the way. Things that grip your interest. You can follow them and they'll lead you uphill. But what I've come to understand now, because there was no role for negative emotion in that, God is like the dynamic interplay between the calling and conscience. So the calling says, come this way towards the greatest treasure, right? The treasure's in this direction. And that'll make itself manifest in different places for different people, even though it's all pointing to the same thing. But conscience comes along for the ride and says, you're deviating from the path. You're deviating from the path. And so God is the call of conscience and the calling. It's the interplay between those two things. And I'm bringing that up because people, they say, well, there's no evidence for God. I can't find God. God is dead. God has disappeared. It's like, well, you don't see the manifestation. And you might say, well, why call that God? It's like, well, try to escape from your conscience. And then try to make yourself interested in things you're not interested in. You can't do that. There's an autonomy about it. And is it a living spirit? At some point, questions like that devolve into a matter of definition. But it's definitely, those are both animating spirits. The conscience and calling are both animating spirits. So for all intents and purposes, not only are they alive, they're immortal. And they're shared by everyone. So
I suppose atheists would just write that off and say that's an evolutionary adaptation.
Right, but the problem is
in order to thrive or something like that.
But it's not a write-off. I say that's fine, have it your way. It's like, so what you're saying is that those two spirits orient you towards like thriving and maximal reproductive fitness. It's like, okay, same, I don't care, have it your way. The practical consequences and even the metaphysical consequences are identical. We could take the biological perspective. It's like, fair enough, okay, so that reflects something fundamental about the nature of being.
Yeah.
You come to it evolutionarily, okay. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. These things dovetail. And look, even scientists assume that there's an ultimate unity. It's part of the presumption of the Western enterprise of science, is that in the final analysis, there's a unity of comprehension. There's a unity of ethic and material reality. Evolutionary biology and theology will dovetail. If they're both laid out correctly, they'll dovetail. And I think we're very close to that now. Very, very close to that. If not already having attained that.
If you haven't checked out my anti-hangover pill after party, check it out at fullerhealth.com. It helps reduce the negative impact of alcohol on your brain and body. And even if you don't drink often, which you shouldn't really, it should be something that's part of your wellness routine that you just have at your house. If you ever decide to have a glass of wine or more, it reduces symptoms of nausea, anxiety, shakiness, and even helps a bit with sleep deprivation because it works on GABA. Mostly it works by breaking down acetaldehyde, which is what poisons you when you drink. If you do like this product, please leave a review at fullerhealth.com. I love reading the reviews. Code MP15 for 15% off. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
You know, when kids are small and they go to public school, they're taught to learn they're taught to learn math, they're taught to learn social studies, they're taught to learn all these different things and to take enough, the same amount of interest in everything, that they have to be doing well in all the different areas. But I've been reading about interest-based education, where you just follow what they want to do, not what they want to do, but what gives them meaning. So if a kid is really drawn to math or really drawn to art or whatever it is, that you capitalize on that, and that bringing and keeping that all alive, that's what guides you.
Well, it's certainly, so there's an upside and a downside to that. So the upside is that if you can find out what someone is spontaneously interested in, they're motivated.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason they're motivated
And you don't kill the rest of everything because you're making them do things that is more difficult for them.
Well, that's right. Well, what happens if you use force is that you decrease positive motivation.
Yeah.
Skinner showed that very clearly with animals, which is why he preferred using reward to punishment. Mm-hmm. So you get all sorts of kickbacks if you use force. So there was a big movement in the 1960s to orient schools around a child's interest. And that turned into child-centered learning. And that was one of the pathways to like the postmodernist catastrophe in education. Mm-hmm. But I think part of the reason for that was that if you can't pursue interest without taking into account conscience. It's too positive, right? There's no shadow to it, mm-hmm. right? And I don't know exactly what that means. I don't know exactly how to integrate those things. Like I said.
Well, maybe with interest, you have to go very deeply into it.
Well, and you have to do it in a disciplined way.
Yeah.
Well, you do. Well, so in the Exodus story, when Moses encounters the burning bush, he's just doing his normal day-to-day shepherd thing, right? And he's pretty happy. His life's going pretty well. But something beckons to him from the side. It glimmers and gleams. And so he goes to investigate it. And as he investigates it, he gets closer and closer to it. So you can imagine he's getting deeper and deeper into it, right, as he pays attention. He eventually realizes he's on sacred ground and he takes off his shoes. So as he pursues what he's interested in and he gets deeper into it, he understands that he's approaching what's sacred, what's most fundamental, right? What's at the pinnacle or what's at the base. Either metaphor works. But he continues in his pursuit. And eventually the voice of God speaks to him. And that's when he becomes a leader. And he's an archetypal leader because he stands up against tyranny and against slavery. And so the moral of the story is that if you pursue what calls to you with enough integrity and discipline, you will get to the bottom of things. And that will make you a leader. Now, it's weird. The Moses story has got an interesting twist in it, too, because God speaks from the depths of the burning bush and tells Moses that he has to go back to Egypt and confront the Pharaoh. So now he has to go after the evil uncle. That's a good way of thinking about it. And Moses said, "Oh, I can't do this." And God says, "Well, why not?" And Moses says, "Well, you picked the wrong guy." And God says, "Well, I know who's the right guy. So what do you mean?" And Moses said, "Well, I'm like tongue-tied. I have a speech impediment. I can't speak." And God basically says something approximating maybe two things. That's your problem, figure it out. But there's another implication there, which is everybody is going to have something wrong with them in relationship to the pursuit of what's best. So standing up against tyranny and again, like, I'm not smart enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not charismatic enough, I'm not resilient enough.
I don't have enough money.
Yeah, I don't have enough influence. Like, there's going to be impediments. And God's response is, I don't care what your impediments are. You can overcome them.
That's your challenge, really.
That's right. Well, and
Yeah.
it isn't also necessarily a weakness, because it's something you have to contend with, but it's going to be something that a lot of other people share. Now, the way Moses deals with it is he enlists his brother, Aaron. So this is another great lesson. It's like, your job is to go stand up against tyranny and to rescue yourself and other people from the habits of slaves and to move towards the promised land. And there's a bunch of things about doing that you're going to be pretty useless at. And so you should recognize them. But then in recognizing them, something else happens, which is very interesting, which is there's a lot of other people around. You could enlist their services, and then there's something for everyone else to do. And that's also a really useful thing to know, to take the kind of messianic mania out of that archetypal idea. Like, if you're seized with the idea that you have this mission, to free the world from tyranny and to decrease people's slavish habits, then that's all on you. Well, that's a crushing responsibility. It's a pathway to kind of manic grandiosity, right? But if you understand that that's true for you, but it's not true for you alone, and that there's plenty of things along the way for absolutely everyone else to do with the same degree of seriousness, well, then you've got the equation approximately right. And that can also help you, like if you're running an organization. It's like, it's okay if other people have important things to do too. You are not going to run out of important things to do. No matter how many you distribute to other people, there's going to be plenty of things for you to do. Right. And so that's such a relief to know that. Yeah. I learned that about 20 years ago, I guess, because I'd been dealing with the problem of evil for a long time, and it felt like a crushing responsibility, especially as I came to understand it more and more deeply. And I thought, well, I have an understanding that appears to be in some ways, I wouldn't say unique, but unique enough so that when I'm sharing it, it has a effect on people. I thought, well, I don't know, like, what am I supposed to do about that? That seems like too much to deal with. And it was at that time too that I realized it's like, well, if it's too much for you to deal with, you're not sharing the responsibility enough, like by definition. And you know that, you've built organizations, is that as you scale them up.
Oh, you can't grow.
That's
because you do reach your capacity.
Right.
And you cannot grow unless you enlist help with other people.
Right, and then what you want to do is so I talked to Frank Stronach about running Magna, and he keeps his factories at a certain size. I think it's 200 or 400, I don't remember which. But what he does is he sets people up with their own independent fiefdoms. He says, this is yours. It's 90%, like, we're still associated, but this is your thing. And like, if you can make it great and you can grow, wonderful. Yeah. It's not a zero-sum game. And that's a lovely thing to understand too. It's very generous. You can operate in the world in very generous fashion. Once you realize that, here's something else that's cool. I worked with Bob Peel for years. Bob was a great graduate supervisor, and there was a real contrast between him and many other professors, because Bob was 100% generous with his ideas. Like, I'd go into his office and talk to him, and I did that like twice a week. We talked a lot. And we would share ideas. And I can generate plenty of ideas, but Bob could generate plenty of ideas, and he didn't care what happened to his ideas. And if he had a graduate student who grabbed an idea and then, came up with an experiment and ran with that, then they got the authorship, and that helped develop their career. But here's something cool, and you can this just makes perfect sense. So imagine there's a biological process that's operating within me that's generating ideas. Okay, now, and it can grow or shrink. Okay, if it's rewarded, it's going to grow. And if it's going to grow, it's going to produce more ideas. And if it's punished, it's going to shrink. Okay, so now my attitude is, I have no faith in that source, fundamentally. I think it's exhaustible. And so now I'm stingy as hell with my ideas. And partly that makes other people suspicious and doubtful. And so every time I share an idea, something negative happens. Well, Do that for 5 years. And even if you had the goose that laid the golden eggs to begin with, it's not laying any eggs. By contrast, you're a creative person. You just give those ideas away freely and you get a tremendously positive response. That's a very rewarding response. All that does is make that capacity grow. And all that happens is that you produce way more ideas. That's why Christ says that he's a well that's inexhaustible, fundamentally. That's what that's pointing to, is that you can't deplete what you have by sharing it properly. Quite the contrary. The better you are at sharing what's been granted to you as a gift, a talent, the better you are at sharing that, the more it's going to thrive. And that's a great thing to know too. Because like you couldn't want a better solution than that.
I think I agree with that mostly. I think the skepticism I have is I really don't like to see people, and this might be, I just realized this a couple of days ago, because you worked with some people and you had a brilliant idea and you kind of gave it to them and they just like took advantage of you and wrecked the idea basically. And I think, I don't know how much that impacted me, but I thought about it a couple of days ago, so it must have impacted me a bit. I don't like...
Well, it was very unpleasant.
Yeah, and I don't like I think you have to be careful about who you give your ideas to, because I don't like seeing beautiful ideas taken by narcissistic people and destroyed.
Yeah. Well, that's the pearls before
like
swine problem. And so Christ tells his followers that they have to be as soft as doves, essentially, and as wise as serpents. And like there is, it's also in biology, that's the cheater problem, fundamentally. If you have a community of cooperators and you drop in one shark, the shark will take everything. And that's the psychopath problem in biology as well. And so you do have to share with judgment. You have to share wisely, and you have to be willing.
And you also have to share without ego and without pride, because if your sharing is full of, then you won't share in the right moments with the right people.
Well, you're also likely to attract more than your fair share of psychopathic responses that way too, because if people see that you're sharing for your own self-interest, and they're the sort of people who are likely to do that, they see your behavior as a justification for what they're going to do. Or you get good
people coming, but it doesn't go well. Because it wasn't the right moment for them to even find the
you
idea.
can't be, there's a big difference between being generous and being naive. Like it's a trick, and there's a big difference between being courageously trusting and naive. You know, so part of the way that I've conceptualized that, and this is very useful for people, naivety looks like virtuous innocence, but it's not. It's just naivety. If you're naive, you will be burned, and you'll be burned to some degree by someone malevolent. Right, so then what happens is you go from naivety to cynicism. And it's hard for you to give up your cynicism because there's an element of it that's wiser than the naivety. And going back to being naive is just like going back to being an infant. It's not an improvement. It's a deterioration, even though the naivety was trustful and so forth. And it wasn't, it was just naive. Naivety, cynicism, courageous faith. Right, and so courageous faith is, I'll cooperate with you. And maybe I'll even do it repeatedly. But I'm going to keep my eyes open, and I know perfectly well that there are snakes around. Right, but the transcendence of the cynicism is, once you understand that the snakes are there, then you think, well, there's just snakes everywhere. I shouldn't trust anyone. I should be contemptuous and doubtful about all institutions. And that's wiser than naivety, especially if it's hard-earned, if the knowledge is hard-earned. But it's not the optimized response. The optimized, and this has been mathematically modeled as well too. Like, because one of the questions is, what pattern best maximizes the utility across repeated social interactions? And one answer to that is tit for tat. You and I are going to play a game. I start. I trust you. I open myself up to betrayal. You could betray me and gain a short-term gain. You don't. You trust me. And then we get the thing going. Now, what happens if you betray me? The best response is, I whack you with proportionate force, and then I open the door to cooperation again. No one has come up, there's small modifications of that, but no one has come up with a strategy that works better in repeated social interactions than essentially tit for tat. Tit for tat with a bias towards, initial cooperation. A guy named Robert Axelrod figured this out. He was interested in the emergence of cooperative strategies because it really is quite a mystery, right? If you're in a distrustful situation and you distrust me, so you're not going to act positively to me, and I distrust you, so I'm not going to act positively towards you, then our responses justify our doubt. Well, how do we get out of that?
And how many times do you play that game with somebody when they betray you? Like, how many chances do people get? Because, like, when you're a busy person and you have more to lose, like, is it once or is it twice? Because I don't think it's 3 times is quite a few times. That's quite a waste of time.
My rule, the rule that Tammy and I have used in our relationship, at least to some degree too, is like, well, when you're interacting with each other constantly, there's going to be variations in irritability, and so maybe she'll say something to me and I'm snappy. And we could do the whole Dante's Inferno thing, or we could think, well, maybe he's hungry or tired, and so you have to have some level of writing it off, and a good rule, and I did this with my clients too, was like, if someone trips over you at work once, it's noise, it's not data. Twice, it's like, then maybe you raise an eyebrow. 3 times, you've established a pattern, right? And then you can go to the person. Well, it's also way more effective as a negotiating strategy because then you can go to the person and you can say, this happened yesterday. And their first response is, no, it didn't, or you're imagining things. But then you say, well, yeah, I thought so too, but it also happened here and it also happened here. And it's like the probability that the person can weasel out of that then is like, it's virtually zero. And then you can have the conversation. Now you can't get too finger waggy about you did this 3 times, because then there's that moral superiority. And the reason you don't want to do that is because you just don't know why the person is doing that. I talked to this guy on my podcast just quite recently who he was going to shoot up a school when he was a high school student. Yeah, and that's pretty bad. And it's obviously unforgivable. But if you listen to his life, you would understand how he got there. Now,
but isn't that the same for everyone? Like, do you know of any evil people or people who do evil things
that don't have a reason?
But not everybody goes through immense amounts of suffering and then turns into a psychopath.
That's definitely true.
There's always reasons for people to be evil, but you can't use those for reasons to be evil.
No. Well, and and I think too, it's like that's sort of the victim perpetrator border. It's like at some point you go from victim, justifiably so, let's say, to perpetrator. It's also not that useful to construe yourself as a victim, no matter what happens to you.
Everyone's a freaking victim. Well, they're alive. Life is hard.
Yeah.
Do you remember in grade 4 when we were learning about bullies? I remember at the time I didn't even like this. We were learning about bullies, and what we learned was, well, if somebody's bullying you, it's because their life is so hard that's why they're bullying you, and you should be nice to them. And I was like, what? I think I also had, I was really sick. Things, it was like, hard life. I know people have hard lives. Like they have hard lives. Doesn't mean you get to be mean to everybody around you.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, because you were taught that you couldn't use your illness for an excuse, really, for anything.
It's also hard to beat up people if you have arthritis.
Yeah, it is.
Maybe I didn't have the option to go to. No, that's not true, because that's not really how girls bully anyway.
Well, I think hardship it's a challenge. It's a challenge to overcome hardship. That's what it is. Doesn't matter.
And hardship can make you virtuous, just like it can make you vicious. Certainly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why there's such an insistence in the Western philosophical ethos on free will. There's no Nietzsche knew this too. He said any situation is susceptible to a multitude of interpretations. Like there's a postmodern element to that, but there's also, you say, well, he was beat up as a kid and that's why he beats his kids. Well, first of all, most people beat as children do not beat their kids. And you can figure that out mathematically, because if child abuse was deterministic, it would spread and everyone would do it. And it isn't spread, it's dampened. And so if you are an abuser, there's a higher than average chance that you were abused as a kid. But if you were abused as a kid, the overwhelming probability is that you won't abuse your children. Right, exactly. So it's tricky, right? Because if you go into the history of someone who's psychopathic and they tell you their life story and they're not lying, you think, oh my God, it's no wonder. But then, you meet someone like Charles Joseph, who was just tortured to death in 50 different ways and clearly decided that, he was going to do everything he could to let that go, certainly not to visit it on his children, and to try to live a virtuous life. Like everyone backslides. And when you backslide and you've been hurt very badly, you backslide into, martyrdom and resentment, and no bloody wonder. But that doesn't mean it's deterministic.
How can you tell when someone really loves you?
Well, it's in the marriage vows. Through sickness and through health, right? Through riches and through poor. And if you're not going to stay through those trials, then there's no love there.
If you don't want to. If you don't want to stay.
What's a decision?
Right, if you don't want to stay.
It's also a decision. Like when we took our vows, it was serious. So it was a solemn occasion, because I meant it. It was like, and I knew by that time more or less what that meant. It's a hell of a thing to say. And I knew that partly from reading Jung. He believed that you couldn't make a marriage work without the commitment, the real full-out commitment, because you can just run away from each other then. You can't solve your problems if you can run away. If the door's open. Because at some point, you'll encounter a marriage problem that looks like the problem is worse than getting divorced. Like, that'll happen. And so if divorce is an option, you just won't solve the problem. And the problem is that there's a problem of that size in virtually every relationship. I mean, that's the problem of Satan fundamentally. Like, there's just no getting away.
Those problems come up, though, if you don't pursue what's meaningful in your life. If you have sins of omission, if you do all those things, then that is the consequence of that, is that you'll find yourself in a place where you think maybe divorce is easier. So you don't want to go there. You want to take care of things every week.
But then at what point is divorce easier? I feel like, because there is a point, but then I feel like, okay, so with my experience, maybe if you get to that point, it's because you didn't know the person very well.
There's lots of reasons you can get to that point. And, I had lots of clients who chose the path of divorce, and they often chose the path of divorce.
We've had family members too.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Right? So.
When they couldn't negotiate with their partner. Now, there's all sorts of reasons you might not be able to negotiate with your partner. One would be you're not skilled enough as a negotiator. Another would be they're actually not interested in
or you're not suitable. You're just not suitable. Your personalities are such that, my sister was I think she was probably pretty agreeable. And her husband was super disagreeable and kind of a loner. Yeah. And he didn't negotiate at all. Yeah. And they grew apart.
Yeah, that often splits men and women. You'll get an agreeable woman who's quite feminine, and a disagreeable man who's quite masculine, and there's no grounds to communicate. The guy just goes, and maybe he's not very articulate, and there's no moving him. And maybe he doesn't even know how to negotiate, because people are so bad at negotiating. It's just a miracle. And it's not surprising, because negotiation is sort of the opposite of a sin of omission. Yeah. If you're negotiating, you have to confront all the things you want to avoid right now. And no one wants that. It's so annoying. It's like, if I'm negotiating with Tammy, I have to listen to all her problems. And it's way easier just to not want to bother with that. But the problem with that is, the problems are there. So like, I can wish that they weren't there all I want, but that isn't going to make them go away. So it's way better just to, and I really don't like it.
No, but you practice with little things. We practice with little things, daily things that we negotiate. And then if you have to negotiate something that's deep and troublesome, at least you've practiced some of it. Maybe you can do it then.
See, I know that that she loves me to the degree that she plays along. And that's a good definition. You know, when we went to Florence, Tammy went to Florence to do a sight-sizing course in Renaissance art. Well, I played along, like wholeheartedly. Well, why? Well, that's like a definition of love. You play along with the person you love, and play is the right metaphor. And we've discovered that more and more, especially in the aftermath of our illnesses. Like we've always been pretty good at playing along with each other because we played together as kids. Like that's a pretty standard pattern.
Yeah, that helped probably.
Yeah, definitely. We learned that we could play along with each other when we were very little, and that was very positive thing. Like that was disrupted in teenagehood for, you know, any number of reasons. But, you know, we've had very serious conversations in the last few years, and one of the things we've made even more clear to each other is like, she can do whatever she wants. I am not interested in getting in her way in the least. If I can figure out where she's headed and I can do something to help her with that, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to assume that will dovetail with what I'm doing. And she's playing along with me. And, you know, we have a weird life, and it's an unbelievable life in many ways. And we come together now and then and think, you know, are we going to continue with this particular game? And like, Tammy's always been up for an adventure. So love is the highest form of play. That's true.
Mm-hmm. That was nice.
Well, we had to get something positive, didn't we?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, well, you can tell when love is in the air, because the spirit of play is what's dominating. One of the things we've been practicing too, like consciously, when we came back together after we were so ill, that was quite complicated because we'd grown apart, and I was still very, very ill when I moved home. And it was even worse than that because I was in terrible shape in the mornings, and then I got like more or less, at least to the point of subhuman by 10 o'clock at night. And I was sort of, you could stand being around me. And by that time, her clock was exactly the opposite, and she was ready for bed. So that made things complicated. And, you know, we came back together around our practice of dating, and that really worked. And that also indicated to us that the core of our relationship was still intact. And, you know, and then my health started to improve, and that made things a lot easier. But like one of the things that we've been striving to do consciously is to conceptualize the best of our romantic interactions, our dates, our dancing, our playing, and to see if we can do that all the time, right? To expand that outward so that our attitude toward every day is that every day, like every minute that you spend together could be the perfect date if you oriented yourself properly. At least that's a hell of a good goal.
And to spread that out to your community.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Right. If you can do that. And,
well, to your family at large and to your friends, and, you know, yeah.
And there's definitely spirit of play in that. Yeah, right.
Because we were driving down the road and I was thinking, well, we had a little accident a couple of years ago, so now I'm a little bit more tentative about being in the car. And so so one day I just said, let's try to bring that spirit of play to the car, to driving.
And my spirit was like hell bent to the next destination, right? With every ounce of intensity I could muster. And so like I'm pretty much pushing the limit on the road all the time because I do that all the time. And then I thought, well, probably I could replace that for the extra 2 minutes I was going to gain, certainly now in particular. I mean, when I was younger, I think there was probably more rationale for flat out intensity, but even then that's better than being useless, but it's not optimized. Right.
Spirit of play is better.
I think you can tell.
And generosity.
I think you can tell when people love you, whether that's like family or significant other, if you can talk to them about your problems and show them who you are without putting on any type of act, and have them still enjoy being around you or like that better than whatever act you're putting on. So you don't have to hide parts of yourself for them to love you.
No,
So
that's right.
it's pretty obvious when somebody loves you. You don't have to be somebody else.
You don't have to be the person they would love if you were them.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the vows are a safety net around that too, right? Because there'll be times when
when you're not you.
well, also when you have to reveal things that, aren't particularly lovable even to you. And if you have to keep those hidden, and that's complicated.
Well, you
because
can't grow and learn if you have to keep them hidden.
no, but sometimes you can have done things in your life that are
I
so
see.
bloody egregious that
I
it
see.
really is a shock to the other person. Like the kind of, that's especially the case, say, if you've had an affair.
Yeah.
How do you bring that to the other person's attention without demolishing the relationship? Generally, you can't.
Well, we haven't had that.
Yeah, well.
We haven't learned about that.
That's good.
So I don't know what to say about that, really. Don't do it. That's what I think. Play with your
Well,
wife.
that's the simplest. Yeah, right. Right. Well, that's another issue with sins of omission too. It's like there's archetypal representations of women, you might say, that men fall back on when they're not differentiated. One would be virgin and the other would be whore, right? And wife gets put in the virgin category, right? Because who wants to have a whore for a wife? At least that's the shallow conception. And the answer is, well, actually, sometimes that is what you want. But then you have to violate your purity norm and you have to let some of the female element of this category into this category. And men have a real hard time with that. So they put their wife on a pedestal and she has to be pure and, virgin mother type. And then that doesn't work because that's an insufficient.
It's not what they want either.
Context is everything. Let's put it that way, right? There's a time and a place for everything, right? And so they'll go looking for the horror elsewhere, and then there are women who just act that out. And, that's not good for them, obviously, either, because then they just end up used and discarded and cynical and psychopathic and bitter and ruined. And that's not a good. So, Tammy mentioned playing is like you want to incorporate that other element into your relationship so that that's also satisfied and you have to admit what you want. And that's very frightening for people. Especially, it's often frightening sexually for people because that's where you're most naked, so to speak, right? So that's where people's vulnerabilities are really, they're right there. And so people won't even admit to themselves what they want. And then that even makes it worse because if you have sexual desires that you don't admit to, that are real, as you refuse to interact with them, they get bitter and resentful.
They get twisted.
They get
probably.
twisted. Oh, yeah, they get twisted and grow into all sorts of monstrous underground forms. And then you really
Not that
can't
we know
admit
anything
them.
about that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we wrap this up we could give people a brief overview of what 2024 looks like for you both.
Well, why don't you start? What are we doing?
Going on a tour.
Huge tour, right?
Yeah, huge tour.
And so why did you agree to that?
Well, you have a new book. So this will mean new lectures. So this will mean new ideas.
When is that coming out?
Probably in November.
But we're
Might
going to
be
start
2
talking
books.
about it right away.
So people are going to hear the ideas
Yeah.
before the book comes
Yeah.
out.
And so
I'll
that
be-
means
I'll
I have
unfold the
to
ideas.
think of new things to talk about. So that's challenging.
Yeah.
And we're going to have people travel with us. So
Pajot has already agreed to.
Cool.
Jonathan Pajot.
We're trying to get Douglas Murray to come along too, like he did in Europe.
Yeah,
He's
it was great
interested,
to
but
have
he has
him
visa
along.
trouble for the U.S., so
Right.
we'll see
right.
if we can arrange that.
And
but there's other
that's
people
really
that will
fun.
get to come along too.
And then we have friends that travel with us, so so it isn't as lonely. And we're going to be in the States, and we know lots of people in the States.
and you also changed up the tour. We did, but it was really under your influence. So what did you do differently?
Well, we have spread out, so we have 3 shows in a row, and then we have 4 days, and then we have 3 shows.
Yeah,
in a row.
otherwise it's just not doable.
I don't think it's doable. So we're going to try this out and see if this 4 days that we have available takes care of the time we need off, the time we need to have dinners with people, podcasts and stuff, and
Our relationship, being able to see the places we're in.
Yeah.
It was doable.
That sounds like
because
4 days,
We've
doesn't
done
it?
it for
Yeah.
5 years, but what we're trying to do, one of the things that people need to understand is that if something really good is happening to you, one of the things you should think through very carefully is, first of all, you should notice, this is unlikely, this good fortune. And then you should think, okay, what impediments are there in the path of this iterating that would accumulate across time? And we've had to work that out on the tour because it got too intense at times. And at some point, you think, well, I just won't do this anymore. But then when you have an opportunity like this, that's an insane conclusion, right? Because it's so unlikely and it's so positive that what that means is you didn't make the right sacrifices along the way. And so now you have to sacrifice the whole damn thing. And so, we've negotiated along the whole way. And I've tried to listen very carefully to Tammy too, to see what has to be modified so that she's enthusiastically on board. That meant modifying the schedule.
That schedule was crazy. I mean, I opened for you guys a couple years ago for like a month. And I was working at the same time, and it was not doable. It's like, this isn't even, it was fun. It was really exciting, but I was exhausted. A new city every day. So
a flight every day?
Oh man.
Yeah.
So I think I was on a bus at that point, so I didn't have to do the flight, but the bus is easier. But I think the 4-day off, we'll see how that goes.
We'll see how that goes.
And we're going to go to South America. So the 50 cities are in the US. We're going to go to Central and South America.
For a week.
Oh,
right?
cool.
That's in June.
Oh, that's
June.
fun. Maybe
So
I'll
we
join
have
for
till,
that.
and then we're going to be at our cottage for most of the summer and fall. That's the plan. And the fall is still
we don't know.
indeterminate,
Yeah.
apart from the fact that the book is coming out. Plus, we're launching Peterson Academy in February. And so that's a big deal. And this ARC enterprise that has got underway in London will unfold. We're planning some regional events, major regional events next year, likely in the United States, possibly in the Middle East. So that's exciting.
We're going to do a conference
Yeah, we're going to do a conference.
next fall.
Yeah.
For Peterson Academy.
Yeah, I think so. Peterson Academy, but we're still figuring it out.
We're going to do a
We'll have
conference
to-
for sure. And under what rubric remains to be determined.
Oh, I see.
Right. So, and I'm very much looking forward to, I'm just about finished my book, and 2 books actually, because it's going to be 2 books. And I'm very excited about that. So I've had the most fun writing this book of any books I've written. And it's come easiest. And I think I got the balance. I wrote Maps of Meaning. It's very hard. And then I wrote 12 Rules and Beyond Order, and they're more publicly accessible. This one is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's harder for sure. It's denser, but it's easier to understand than Maps of Meaning. And I think that it'll be revelatory. That's the idea. I cannot see that people will read this book and understand it. And I think it'll demolish the atheistic argument.
Well, it's demolished
permanently.
his atheism, I guess.
Well, that happened a long time ago.
Oh, I see.
But
That'd be wild.
well, you can see it happening already.
I know,
Because
I think you
there are
can.
people like Ian Hersey Ali and Neil Ferguson and Douglas Murray who have come to either like full-fledged acceptance of a theistic viewpoint, or at minimum a deep understanding of the fact that like a moral humanistic endeavor in the absence of an underlying metaphysical foundation it has no staying power. It's weak. It's going to be blown over immediately by ideology, by competing religious claims, by new spontaneous religious forms, veganism or vegetarianism or
Climate.
or nature worship. That's right, the climate thing. Like that's become pretty obvious. So I'm very excited about it, and that's partly why we're also so happy to be going on tour, because it's going to be very interesting to see the response.
And
And
it's good that we can still do our podcasts, because I really like doing my podcast.
Yours has been doing
Learning
really
a lot.
well.
I really like
yeah,
speaking
you've
with
done how
people.
many?
Oh, I don't know. Over
100.
100. Yeah.
Well, you're
Yeah,
gonna
yeah.
surpass me.
Well, you've been busy.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
You've been busy too.
Well, I
Yeah,
haven't
you've
had
been
any
on
babies.
tour.
No,
That's
you're
true.
not-
The
that's
baby
You're
makes
not
you
having
really
babies.
busy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does. It does.
Yeah,
it does.
no, I'm
you-
not that
you're-
busy.
Well, and you've had, well, that's another thing that's sort of on the table for you. We're going to go back to Italy, and both of us are interested in pursuing artistic endeavors to a much greater degree than we have. And like, that's something that beckons in the future for me and for you.
I told you we're gonna find out you've made money through touring and through your books and things, but you're going to be an artist, and that's actually what's going to be the most valuable thing you do. That'd be pretty funny.
That would be pretty funny. That would be funny. I can certainly see that it would be the most fun. I mean, I've had such a good time making music, and that's been just a blast. And Tammy and I have both really, really enjoyed that. We have really good people to work with, so that's been ridiculously fun. So I could imagine doing that for like 10 years.
In music videos?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. And I wrote a screenplay on a Brothers Grimm story. And Marshall and I and Tammy and Sonia and Victor have recorded 5 or 6 or 7 songs for that. And so Marshall's already put them together. So, and it's getting easier and easier to make a movie. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but it's a more straightforward thing for me, especially if I want to do something animated. So, that's more like a 3-year plan. So
all good things.
Yeah, good things. That's right. Grandkids, good things.
yeah. Yeah, well, in our various enterprises, like I enjoy working with Julian on essay, and that's going very nicely. And we're having quite a blast with our various ventures. And Peterson Academy,
It's going to be huge.
well, it's an adventure. I mean, I'm very happy with the way it's going. And so congratulations on that. I think you've done a bang up job, and we have excellent professors, and they're all thrilled to be participating.
Everybody seems very happy with
Yeah.
it.
Oh, and we have the gospel seminar coming up in beginning of April, right? And so everybody's on board with that, because we had a great time when we did the Exodus seminar. Everybody loved it. And so everyone I invited back said, tell me when it's going to happen and I'll be there. And the Daily Wire has been very enthusiastic about it. And so I'm really looking forward to that, because I walked through the Gospels in great detail writing this book.
Gospels will be fun.
Yeah, well, the book,
Yeah.
what people can expect from the book is the same thing that they saw in the Genesis lectures in 2017, except much
That's
wider
cool.
and much deeper.
So
And
that's the tour too. It's going
That's
to be
the
similar
tour
to
too.
that.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's very cool. I wonder if I can come along for some of that. I don't know.
Well,
though.
you're welcome
I have
to.
multiple children now.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
Makes it a little tricky.
see if you can come
Maybe-
along for
maybe
some of it.
next
Bring
year.
people
I
that
don't know. He's pretty young.
He's pretty little.
Yeah.
But they do travel pretty well, those
They
little
do.
guys.
They do. And bring people along that can help you.
Yeah. Okay.
Make it work. Make it work. But do come along.
Maybe like Mexico or something would be fun.
Yeah.
We'll
it
see.
would be.
Well, and we'll probably go out on the road again next fall.
Yeah.
So, even if you miss the first 6 months, I don't think it doesn't look, we'll see how these tickets sell. But so far it's looking good, because when we announced the new tour, we put the tickets up on sale, and some of the venues were 40% sold out within a week without us advertising. So if our sense is, at least so far, like as long as public demand stays high and as long as we have something new to offer, there's no real reason to stop doing this. That's a very positive experience, and it seems to be good for people, and it's helped the ARC thing grow, and we've made crazy connections all over the world. We want to extend those into Africa and into Southeast Asia and South America. And
Southeast Asia would be
Australia.
cool.
yeah,
I'm going to join for that one.
yeah, come to South Korea.
Yeah, that would be really fun.
I
Okay,
think
I'll
that
do
would
that
be-
one for
Take
sure.
a whole busload of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be fun. Yeah, we'll do a big stadium in Seoul.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you guys both for coming on.
What are you
Good to be
excited
here.
about? What are you excited about in 2024?
Oh, I mean, I'm really excited about launching Peterson Academy.
And why are you so interested in that? What has it been about?
You know what? Maybe part of it is you put such an emphasis on needing a degree. You're a university professor. So I actually was a bit confused because I knew I wanted to have kids young, and young to me was in my 20s. And I also thought that the best thing I could do for my career would be to get a PhD. And I remember being like, I was like 18, being like,
Yeah, I remember.
that doesn't really line up. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't really line up. You can't really have kids in your 20s and get a PhD. It's like, how am I going to have time for both? So that was always kind of in my head.
Maybe that's a problem
And
we're
then-
going to solve with Peterson Academy.
Yes.
Like maybe we can offer people PhD level training if we get this thing really humming, and
100%.
and so that young women could still have children when they're
Yeah.
that would be
So
good.
that would be great. So it would solve that problem. But I also, when I went to university, I had such an abysmal time like everybody I learned from, I mean, I had you as a dad, that probably didn't help, but everybody I learned from was like, this person's not very smart. That's kind of and I don't think I came from like a haughty place. I was just listening and it wasn't that interesting. And there were things that were pretty wrong. And a lot of it felt like a waste of time. And I took a loan out to go too.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And then I had Scarlett and I quit. Like I dropped out anyway. So I have like 4 years and 2 half degrees from switching universities and trying to pursue different things and find something that was interesting. And I guess I'd like that disappointment. It's annoying. The university problem's annoying. I think they take advantage of a lot of young people, put them in a boatload of debt, don't teach them anything that's worth learning and bettering themselves, and then say, hey, yeah, you need this degree to get a job. It's like, why? Why do I need this random degree to get a job that has nothing to do with it? That's just some weird societal thing that isn't even relevant anymore. Apparently, 54% of businesses in 2024 aren't going to require a bachelor's degree anymore.
Yeah,
so
well,
it's like it's
I don't-
on
when
its
Harvard
way out.
and UPenn and MIT advertised themselves the way they did in Congress, that certainly comes as no surprise.
Yeah,
I think the education system, the, K to 12 and the university is going to change. I mean, we've gone from kids used to go to school maybe from grade 8 to maybe grade 12, but maybe grade 10, like maybe a couple of years of school, and then they went off and worked. And now we have kids in school from like 3 until 25.
Yeah.
It's like, what? What are we doing? And if we could help children to find an avenue of interest and depth when they're young and then launch them out into the world, then that'd be much better.
Yeah, well,
I
that
think.
was a fundamental ambition of mine back in junior high when I was sitting in my class,
Oh,
tearing
man.
my hair
Yeah,
out, thinking
yeah.
this is
Awful.
Well,
Waste
and the
of
thing is,
time.
it's way more awful now
yeah.
because like my teachers were uninspiring, but they weren't uninspiring and ideologically addled and malevolent, right?
Right.
So I thought it was bad already. Now it's unconscionably bad.
Yeah. Well, hopefully when we expand, I mean, the other thing that excites me about Peterson Academy, I think, is the social element, because it's like social media. I mean, you can find people you like on Instagram, you can make connections and things, but I think having people who are interested in learning and improving their lives on a platform where they can communicate with each other, because we have the social media component, could be really beneficial for people.
Yeah.
And then who knows how that'll grow if we can turn on locations so people can meet with people, each other.
Yeah.
And maybe in a year or so, when we see how this is going, we can expand so that we can be teaching younger kids.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Well, and maybe we'll be able to bring people together in conferences and so forth, and
Yeah.
on a relatively
Yeah.
regular basis. I mean, one of the things we've envisioned, as you know, is having, if we have enough students to make it worthwhile, is having local conferences where we bring 8 of our best professors in for 2 days and bring people together, and they can meet and they can get hyper educated for a boot camp for 16 hours of lectures in 3 days, and that could work very, very efficiently. And it's also a model that isn't necessarily targeted only to people who are 18 to 22.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
And there's
it's
no
to
reason
anybody.
that university education should be targeted to people who are 18 to 22.
No.
That just makes no sense.
That's the other thing we should probably clarify is, yes, it's not targeted towards a specific age. It's if you want to learn the content, it's there.
Yeah.
You also don't have to pursue a diploma if you don't want to. You can just take the courses and learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll have quite a flexible accreditation model. So,
Yeah, that's really exciting. So that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah.
And growing the podcast and doing in-person podcasts. Obviously, the baby is very exciting. A little hormonal right now, but very exciting. And then, I don't know, I've got some other things. I've got the Fuller Health
yeah.
supplements going on. That seems to be doing really well. And what else? There's more. Well, I've got some ideas going on. We have this dating app idea.
Right,
So
right. Yeah, yeah. We talked about that.
I
a
want to
fair
do
bit.
that really badly. I
Yeah.
wanted to do that for a while. So, but that's a little bit in the future. Oh yeah. And then the diet things. I mean, Line Diet's just a brand of its own now. That seems to be helping people. And I want to keep expanding that. Cause I think it's beneficial for people.
And learning more about our health, right?
Yeah. And learning more about our health. So It's a lot. My plate is
Well,
full.
That's
It's definitely is overflowing.
yeah. Well, we had a great year. Like 2023 was like we planned it quite carefully, and everything we planned worked.
Yeah.
And we
Yay.
have a very good team. Our team has
we have a
been
really
excellent.
good
Our
team.
logistics guys, our security guys, our agents,
Yeah. Smooth. It's smooth.
yeah, our tour manager, deadly people. Like they don't cause trouble. They're extremely helpful. They're completely on board. Our secretary,
Enthusiastic.
Jordan Spencer, he's
Yeah.
great. And very good. All the people around me are very good at dealing with the public, and that's been a tricky thing to manage, to find security people who are good at logistics and dealing with the public. But all the things we planned far in advance, they all laid out. The ARC conference was spectacularly successful, and it's worked out real well online. I mean, I think Konstantin Kissin's talk on the ARC site alone has 1 million
he
views,
killed
and it's
it.
got at least another 1 million, in views in distributed platforms. Yeah, he nailed it. And it's not the most popular talk now.
Oh, it is.
Oh.
No, the energy talk by Steve. His name momentarily escapes me, but it's the #1 talk on the ARC site. Yeah, on an intelligent energy policy.
Not Coonan, right?
No, it wasn't Coonan. So
wow.
that's very exciting. The ARC thing is extremely exciting, and
It's a new thing.
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah,
Well,
It's just getting going.
sounds good. Here's to 2024 then.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, thanks for the invitation, Mick,
Yeah,
and for
thank you.
being hospitable while we've been staying with you for the last complicated 3 weeks.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. It's been easy.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. That's high praise indeed. When you're staying with family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right.